الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Dear guests, welcome to the fifth session of the Dca Book Talks. In this series, our main purpose is to bring scholarship to the community and make our community more educated, more knowledgeable about Islam and about history of Islam, and make informed decisions about what is going on in the world and what is going on in the Islamic studies, contemporary Islamic studies, what people are writing about, what are the recent books that are published. One of them is Islam and World History, inshallah, that we are going to talk about today. And we are doing this event under Dca Islamic Research Institute, which is an institute founded by the Dca Center of America, as part of the Dca Center of America. Looking back, alhamdulillah, in our four sessions, we had important professors who wrote important books about Islamic history and about Islam. One of them was Michael Philip Penn from Stanford University. In his book, we talked about his book, Envisioning Islam, Syria, Christians, and Early Muslim World. We also talked with John Esposito of Georgetown University and about his influential book, Islamophobia, The Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century. And in our first session, we hosted Professor Dr. Salih Sayılgan, again from Georgetown, and talking about his recently published book, Following the Prophet, The Life and Spiritual Legacy of Muhammad. And in our fourth session, we hosted the chair of the history department at the University of Maryland, Professor Ahmed Kara Mustafa, and we talked about his book, which was Sufism, the Formative Period. Alhamdulillah, each one of these conversations were very helpful for us, deepened our understanding of Islam, and we hope, inshallah, today's session as well will help us understand Islam better, historically, spiritually, and also socially, that we are going to focus a lot today, inshallah. We are honored to host Imam Tom. I hope he can hear us now, and if he can turn his video so that we can see his beautiful face, inshallah. He was with us a few weeks ago, alhamdulillah, and Dr. Susan is still with us, alhamdulillah. We hosted him with his family and with his kids for some events here, for some programs, and Jum'ah Khutbah. And we are glad to have him here, the Ustad Dr. Susan Douglas. I would like to introduce them shortly before we start our session, if you allow me. Imam Tom Facchine, you can help me, Ustad, about how to pronounce. This is a challenging surname for many people.
Step number one, you have to put your hands together like this.
Why what?
You have to put your hands together like this.
Okay.
And then you have to say Facchine.
Facchine.
Aywa.
Good. MashaAllah, good. Imam Tom Facchine is the research director at Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, and he's also an instructor at Legacy International Online High School, together with Ustad Suzanne, and he earned his BA, bachelor's degree in political science and international relations from Vassar College, where he embraced Islam, and later completed degrees in classical Arabic and comparative Islamic law at the Islamic University of Medina, one of the prestigious Islamic universities in the world, actually one of the most, I would say, maybe the most. He also completed chaplaincy training under the supervision of Prophet's Mosque, and he currently serves as the Imam of the Muslim Community Association of, again, a difficult spelling for me, Mohawk Valley in New York, let's say. And then he is also
Kardashim, that's not true anymore. That hasn't been true for about 2 or 3 years.
Subhanallah. This is, as far as I know, but let's say, to best of my knowledge, I would add that note at the end.
Allegedly.
And we are grateful to have him here today with us, alhamdulillah, back at the DCA, and inshallah, we are going to have him soon in person again. And instead, Dr. Suzanne next to me, alhamdulillah, she is now a retired senior researcher and educator with extensive experience in Islamic and world history education. She earned her PhD in world history from George Mason University and her MA in Arab studies from Georgetown University. She also served in key academic and educational roles, including at Georgetown Centers for Contemporary Arab Studies and UN Alliance for Civilizations, and also has authored influential books and works and on Islamic studies and Islamic education in the United States. We are honored to have them both here and benefit from their scholarship and experience. And both of the hosts today, the guests today, alhamdulillah, they are both working at Legacy International High School, online high school. When it comes to the book, if I can have it in my hand, Islam in World History is a very fresh book. SubhanAllah, when Imam told us here, the book was just came out, and then I talked to Dr. Fatih about how influential this book looks like. I didn't read it yet at that time, SubhanAllah. So it is a fresh book, recent book that was published, just came out of the oven, I sense it now. Alhamdulillah. And this book represents a significant contribution to the field of Islamic history, and it situates Islam within the Abrahamic tradition and also global historical context. And it also traces the development of Islam and Muslim societies over 14 centuries, from the beginning to the modern time. It also emphasized diversity within Islamic civilization, the institution, and also the connections with the Afro-Eurasian cultures and civilizations. And also it provides a global understanding of Islam based on common understanding, but also avoiding common misconceptions and misunderstandings that we will learn a lot today from the two of the guests, inshallah. And the program structure for today, inshallah, we are going to have a short presentation by both of the authors about their book, and then we will start. I will pose several questions, and then we will have a Q&A, inshallah, learn from them. But the most important thing before setting the stage for today is that 14 centuries of Islamic history, or Islamicate history, let's say, we had multiple hundreds or thousands of historians writing books about history of Islam. And recently as well, many books written by many people belonging to different cultures, religions, academic schools, legal schools. Why do we need such a book now, and what is the importance of this book? Why do we need an Islam in World History by Routledge, which was published recently? And then just after this question, this can set the stage, we can start learning about the main arguments, core arguments of the book, inshallah. We can start perhaps with Ustadha Suzanne, as she is here.
I will start only by saying, after all of what he said, it's only half an inch thick. Okay, so the first thing about the book that you should know is that it is part of a series of, I think, 15 books edited by Peter Stearns, a world historian and the former provost of George Mason University, and also still a professor there, who himself has written over 100 books, which is hard to imagine, but it's true. And so, so we were requested to write one in this series that Routledge publishes. And I will say also, Routledge is very well known in this country for supporting education in various, at the secondary level certainly, and at the collegiate level. So the purpose of the series was to situate certain things within the state of being within world history. So that's what we were asked to do, and it happened that the two of us were teaching the course and had developed this course basically from scratch for Legacy International Online High School, which is based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and which has students literally from across the United States and across the world, actually. We have now almost 200 students. We teach this course in 11th grade. Of course, our students are fantastic, and so we lay on them some pretty heavy stuff in the course of our course. The idea, of course, the basic premise of the book is that Islam is an integral part of world history, that it experienced many types of interactions, that we also sort of look at the flow of Islamic history from the Prophet, and this was where our takeoff point is, which is to outline the position of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, which is one of the things I'll talk about a little bit later, probably, the way the Arabian Peninsula has been understood in the West versus, I think, how geography mandates it to do so. And then we go very lightly through the Sirah Nabawiyya, and then we come out with the core of our course, which is what was the prophetic mandate, particularly in Khutbat al-Wida, is just kind of a moment in time where Islam, was complete and was set on the course that others would follow, that others would spread the message. From there, we move on to situating it within the historical context of its time. And And then moving on to several, we have decided 8 chapters, and each one represents a specific period, growth and the succession, and then growth and division, and then we'll work through those sort of one by one. One of the important components is also our observations, which we share with students on what we say dialogue between Islam and the West. It's not the central core of the book, but it certainly features in it in terms of the changes, particularly in the modern era. I'm going to then hand it off to Tom.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Thank you very much for the organizers and to my colleague, Dr. Douglas, who's put up with all of my nonsense. She knows what that all encompasses. I would like to echo Dr. Douglas's comments and just also highlight a little bit of the timing of the book and what makes it significant. We actually were contracted to write this book, if I'm not mistaken, before October 7th took place. And then after October 7th and the fallout of October 7th, each of us found it extremely difficult to write. We took we took up and spent all of our social credit with Routledge as they patiently awaited for something that didn't look like it was coming. But ultimately, when they finally sat us down and said, look, you have to give us something, we realized that this book project became more significant due to the genocide that was happening in Gaza. Because one of our observations was that the Ummah as an entity has problems, and we could even say failures in solidarity. And if you back it up one step, the failures in ummatic solidarity are also, or at least partially, rooted in a failure of ummatic identity. The post-colonial nation states that rule the world, the international order that we've all seen exposed, is something that has Bangladeshis feeling Bangladeshi and Indians feeling Indian and Tunisians feeling Tunisian. And so what is the antidote, or what is one thing that would instill a more ummatic identity, or what even is responsible for a lack of ummatic identity across the Muslim world? And that is partly a lack of ummatic history and memory. And so when Bangladeshis don't know about the history of North Africa, and North Africans don't know the history of East Africa, and East Africa doesn't know the history of Bosnia, etc., we don't really have any possibility for ummatic solidarity. So this work came, again, with more significance in light of this, and I think it informs part of the project that we embarked upon, that we wanted to stitch together, in addition to, talking about the situatedness of Islam in world history. We wanted to try to tell a story of the Ummah, wanted to try to give a narrative history of the Ummah as much as possible within the constraints that we had, because we realized that in many ways, this either hasn't been done before, or if it has been done before, we were not satisfied with previous attempts. Either they were too romantic and fluffy, if you will, not substantial enough, or they had methodological problems. I think within my presentation, I'm going to get into some of the problematics of historiography in Islamic history. But this was a tremendous starting point for us that that informed the work.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. Maybe I heard that you will have a presentation that you can share on the screen, or
no, it's just the main talk.
Sure. Maybe to set the stage for the audience as well. In the book, From Place to Place, I saw that you use the term Islamicate. I studied at the University of Chicago, and we learned there from Marshall Hudson. Yes. He was teaching there, right? So he belongs to the Chicago School, to say, in history. And he used the term Islamicate instead of Islamic. So they don't say, though this school avoid saying Islamic, and they use the term Islamicate more often, because they believe that it does not reflect really the Islamic civilization. And Islamicate, in this sense, as far as I understood, reflects the cultural, the social complexities, and also the civilizational phenomena that is associated with the Muslim, with Islam as a religion, but not directly related to religion itself. So would you be able to make the distinction between the two, and why you prefer to choose that term for your book? Because I when I was there, I also read multiple critique of that term, and terminology of how we can use a term Islamicate to label, let's say, a Jewish scholar writing on a Muslim land, like Musa and Maimonides in Spain, in Andalus, let's say, or another scholar writing in Baghdad as a Christian scholar. So according to this term, he would be an Islamicate scholar. But would he call himself Islamicate? So if you can reflect more on that, why do we need to use the term Islamicate instead of Islamic? Now we can connect it more with other topics as well.
Yes, I believe, and we're very indebted to Hodgson's work, and cite it within our book. But there's still something missing from that framing. It has very, very powerful or profound descriptive power in that it is able to describe the civilization, right, which is not, exclusively Muslim or exclusively Islamic. But it leaves one stone unturned, in my humble opinion, which is that it doesn't rest with one of the problematics that we try to address within Islamic history and within Islamic studies, which is trying to settle what is the methodology and what are the metaphysical assumptions of the historical methodology that we are using. If we are constricted to the historical critical method or naturalistic philosophies of history, then we are without all of the tools at our disposal. We are merely talking about, again, material history, what happened. We look at intentions, we look at motives, we look at these things. We don't structurally include the divine. We don't structurally include miracles. If we do, then we have to ascribe it to say, oh, well, there's these people who believe in these things. So we're hesitant, or I'll speak for myself. I'm hesitant to concede to a method that entirely erases as a source of truth the divine. And that was one of the correctives that the book subtly, I think, or at least my parts of the book subtly tried to correct, that to realize that materialist naturalistic history is a method. It has very clear metaphysical assumptions. It sidelines certain things, and even types of knowledge. There's an epistemology to it as well that sidelines things like the oral tradition and revelation. And it brings us to a point where we have to question, is there anything that's Islamic? And what is it? Right? Is everything just historical construction? And by historical construction, we mean, is everything just people making stuff up? And as believers, we believe the answer is no. So there is something that is Islamic at the bottom of it, even if the Sharia and the structure of the Sharia is meant to accommodate much more than what is simply Islamic. But now we have sort of a chicken and egg situation where, it's Islamic to accommodate more than what's Islamic. And so now we get Islamicate. But in a very real way, how do we talk about the revelation? How do we talk about the ijtihad of the scholars? How do we talk about the method of preserving hadith? And that was that's another problematic that we attempt to address, the skepticism bordering on disdain for hadith in historiography of Islamic history or Islamic studies. So these are very real questions. And we wanted to do, at least I should say, again, speak for myself, I wanted to push back against some of the materialistic assumptions and methodologies that usually are taken as givens. And that's why, to me, it is important to carve out a space for recognizing that Islamic history, yes, there are things that are Islam. It's not all just what people happen to believe or what the aggregate of what Muslims happen to believe. There are things that were revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are things that were said by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There are things that were agreed upon by the Ummah or agreed upon by the scholars. And the scholars indeed are the gatekeepers of that epistemology. So trying to carve a space where that is taken seriously and as fact, or at least as possibility, and not a priori erase it through other terms, with full recognition and even utilization of the Islamicate as a useful analytical category.
I definitely need to weigh in on that particular term. I very early in my education about Islam, which took place after I accepted Islam in Germany, and realized that despite the fact that I had an undergraduate degree in history, I had not been taught thing one about Islam, to the point of barely knowing its existence in Germany. This is back in the 1970s and early 70s. So Hodgson is one of the few historians of writing in English language who I said got it. In contrast to many of the the Orientalist historians going back to the 19th century and certainly into the 20th and into the very present. I also deal with teaching about religion as education outreach to private schools, public schools. That's what I've been doing for almost 40 years now. And so this term is, I don't think we need to take it to too many abstractions because there are so many there are a few choices that have been chosen or a few terms that have been chosen to associate with. Islamic has often been overused. It has been, Islamic cooking pots, Islamic trade routes, anything that has to do with Muslims. Even the term Islamic civilization versus Muslim civilization, where Islamic should be that which pertains to the religion and its teachings, exactly as Tom says. And Muslim civilization is what human beings have been responsible for doing with all of that, and living out in the world. The other issue is, as far as teaching, we call it Arabic. For example, when we come to speak about Arab science or Arabic science or Islamic science, when in fact many of them were Persian speaking or were, from many different religious and particularly linguistic backgrounds. So when we look at the term Islamicate that Hudson coined and goes at great length in his introduction to the 3-volume set, but this was not a 3-volume set. It was a small compressed book. I think we had 28,000 words with it, something like that, in which to make our case. So many Muslims, especially the beginners that are beginning, maybe college students and our very own Islamic, our Muslim students, come into their early study of Islamic or Muslim civilization, Islamicate civilization, not realizing that Islam didn't suddenly become, with the expansion of territory under Muslim rule, did not suddenly become the majority religion by any stretch of the imagination. Muslims were ruling as a very small group. But there's an important point to be made in the fact that that Islam has been an open civilization. The old red herring about the supposed destruction of the Library of Alexandria because we have the Quran and Umar ibn Khattab was supposed to have ordered, burn the library, which had burned 400 centuries earlier. You still see this in the press. You still see this story mentioned in the press. You can Google it and see just how many arguments there are about that, when it is a totally, finished fact that it did not happen. But the fact that Islam was an open society that involved from the very beginning people of multiple faiths who were already occupying the region into which Islam geographically expanded. Their contributions were significant. Their role as culture brokers, as translators, as booksellers, book collectors, all of those things, and that Islam continued to be a multi-religious society, which is something that Europe, for example, Western Europe never succeeded in doing. And this has stamped its own fate and is unfortunately still with us today. So by recognizing the word Islamicate, it simultaneously recognizes that not everything that took place in Muslim society was, if you will, in accordance with Islamic teaching, but it was also not all only contributing to. And I think the most important point that Hudson made was that that this society was stamped by Islam. This society was, at the core of it, was Islam, Islamic teachings, and the whole system of thought and all of it that went with that. And so when we're speaking about it, I mean, we have to think of some of the crazy terms, fundamentalists. My personal favorite, least favorite, is Islamist, right? We don't have, Judaists and Christianists. We have, though, Islamists, which sort of was replacing, the idea, and a student of Islam is an Islamicist. So you add two abstractions on the back of it. This term Islamicate, I think, is a generous term. It is one that expresses a lot, and I don't think we need to deconstruct it to the point of feeling that it has too much of a secularist core in it. That's all I want to say about that. But as a teaching term, as a public term, I think it's really quite useful. And I thank Hudson forever for that, among many other things.
This is pretty much in line with what you have said also in other chapters of the book, about the gradual spread of Islam and the gradual conversion of people to Islam, because you are talking about in your book how the maps are drawn with lines, with colors. So when the Abbasids take over Baghdad and other regions, you just make it green, and then people tend to think that everyone is Muslim now. That the term Islamic actually in this scenario and in this situation is pretty much helpful, because in our first session that I talked about, we had Michael Phillip there. He talked about how the Muslims and the Christians coexisted together in the Middle East, in Quds and other places, and they worked together, they studied together, and to an extent that the head of the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, the main most important translation institution and research institution, let's say, at the Abbasid time, was Beit al-Hikmah. The head of it was a Christian, a Syrian, right? And many other Christian or non-Muslim scholars were there to help the translation movement. And as the Ustad said, Islam as an open religion, open to anything that is challenging Islam itself. Philosophy, science, knowledge, religion, because the Muslims, when they came out of Arabian Peninsula and when they started the conquest, it was very fast. Politically it was very fast. Militarily it was very fast. But intellectually it was very challenging for them to encounter the Christians in let's say in Nisibis school in Middle East, in Mesopotamia, to encounter the Greek philosophy, to encounter the Indian, Persian literature. It was very difficult for them because they were relatively less, how to say, knowledgeable about these things. I don't want to, of course, downgrade the knowledge of the Arabs. They were great in literature, in poetry, and other things, but not to a level in theology, for example. When they heard about the Assyrians in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, they were mesmerized by those debates and they wanted to learn. They were not hesitant about what if they are more convincing than our own arguments. That's why Ilm al-Kalam, al-Aqaid, Ilm al-Kalam emerged from those encounters. So subhanAllah, it is very much in line with what we have said in the book. If you could share more insight about for our audience about the spread of Islam, Imam Chong, how you talk about this, how Muslims tend to be thought in a way that they are a Middle Eastern religion, but the majority of the Muslims are in South Asia, or let's say in Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and many of those regions were converted to Islam or reverted to Islam without sword. So this challenging the thesis of spread of Islam by sword, to me, it was a major contribution that I have heard in this book and many other books as well. But if you can highlight that more and then give us more insights, please.
Sure. I mean, it's fairly straightforward, taking from Hodgson and other works, about the also other scholars that have mapped conversion rates, that the spread of Islamic belief, people converting to Islam, happened at a slow rate that defies the narrative of Islamophobes that, Islam was spread by the sword. Rather, that this is something that's a bit of a projection because Christianity, doesn't really necessarily have a better resume when it comes to this issue than Islam does. In fact, it's quite worse. I'll let Dr. Douglas perhaps pick up on that thread and fill it in a bit more, but I want to highlight the other thing that you brought up, which dovetails with my previous comments on delineating what is human activity from the divine and what is Islamic versus Islamicate. And push back a little bit on the idea that, there's necessarily a hierarchy between different traditions of reason. And I'm taking here from Dr. Sherman Jackson. And I take very seriously his thesis in Islam and the problem of Black suffering, where the encounters of, we can say it, the Islamic or the implicit Islamic tradition of reason that is implicit in the Quran. It's not laid out explicitly. It's found, discovered implicitly in the Quran and in the Hadith. Comes into contact with other traditions of reason, one of them being Greek, and specifically within the Greek tradition, Neoplatonism, comes in contact with other traditions of reason, and that creates very, very interesting exchanges, but also very, very contested debates. And so now you have this same dialectic dynamic playing out where you have human knowledge and human frames and certain assumptions that are made even entire epistemologies, right, that are jockeying now for supremacy. And so one of the things that we try to do in the book is to periodize that out. The history of Aqidah, and, some people will say, okay, well, is Aqidah as a discipline purely a human construction that it took human beings, again, a secular perspective was that it took human beings to come and extract and to codify and to do these things. And so therefore Aqidah is purely a human invention. Like, no, that's not true. There's a text, and the text is a discursive tradition, and it anchors things, and things are not so plastic that you can interpret it in just any way. And there are rules, and the ulama come and they articulate usul al-fiqh, and they articulate philology and the rules of language. And so you have a certain epistemic anchor in the Quran and the Sunnah, and then that, as they're articulating that tradition of reason, it comes into contact with other traditions of reason, and there are certain flashpoints. This is how the Mu'tazila and the controversy of i'tizal comes about, and then teaching how we go through it, or periodize it, or conceptualize it and teach it from the book is a different, we could say foreign perhaps, tradition of reason that's coming in contact with a more comfortably indigenous one that is more implicit in the texts. And then the response to that, i'tizal, which is heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, then becomes threefold. You have the school of Imam Ahmed and the traditionalists, and then you have the Ash'aris and you have the Maturidis. But all three of these responses, yes, it is an articulation, and it is a distillation of trying to articulate what is truly Islamic and what is not. So the borders are now being policed, you could say, or the borders are being maintained, whereas there is an external pressure and then a response to it. And this happens again when it comes to the philosophers versus Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah. And one of the things also that we touch on the book is that Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah, even though they have different responses, should be understood as a response to the philosophers, whom, such as, Al-Farabi and company, Al-Razi, well, less Al-Razi, and the others, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, who are attempting to erase the distinction between prophetic knowledge and philosophical knowledge. And then here comes a two-movement response. The first movement is Al-Ghazali, who takes a certain response about no, ma'rifah and the experience of the divine is the truest form of knowledge. And then after him, Ibn Taymiyyah, who has, you could say, a much more radical critique of that, saying that, getting into similar points that I just made, you could say that my treatment of that issue is Taymiyyan, in the sense that there are multiple traditions of reason, and reason is not just one thing, and reason is quite an amalgamation of several different senses, some of which are cognitive and demonstrative, such as Greek syllogism, and others which aren't, such as intuition, such as synthesis, such as badahiyya, these things that Ibn Taymiyyah writes about. So it's relevant to your point about different traditions of reason and how Islamic intellectual history is shaped as it continues to expand and bump into other traditions of reason.
I want to back up a little bit on the question that you asked about the spread of Islam, and just go to the very basics, which is helpful. It's because when we're working with students and teachers and others, who are trying to explain in the context of world history, which is taught pretty much all over the U.S. and elsewhere, and to our own students, this idea we have to make a separation. You can easily make a separation between the rapid expansion of territory under Muslim rule versus the spread of Islam among those people. And according to the researchers back in the late 1970s by Richard W. Bulliet at Columbia University, who's not been fundamentally challenged on this research, even though he laid it out and it was quite innovative at the time using quantitative history. He used the biographical dictionaries, which were very plentiful at the time, are still plentiful, kind of who's, starting with Hadith scholars and other people like that, and going on to intellectuals of all kinds and prominent people. So he was able to tabulate something like 5,000 entries, data entries, for various different regions, starting with with Iran, Iraq, and North Africa, and all the way to Spain, to use this data, which was the sequence of naming leading back to, you know, the kunya name, the person, there, even so, and recognizing a name that was not indigenous to Islam, was identified the generation of conversion in certain prominent families and, you know, people who made it into these biographical dictionaries. And it's quite amazing what he discovered by doing that. But what he was able to do was to track along the continuum of Islamic history, how this, at what rate this expansion had taken place, not to reach 100% or such and such a percent, but the percent of converts, right? And so he was able to determine that in even places like Syria, Iran having been one of the most rapid, it took between 200 and 400 years before Islam reached majority status. That's pretty dynamic, 200 to 400 years. So when you're talking, there is absolutely no evidence of battlefield conversions on any kind of mass scale. There's no evidence like what happened in Granada when Ferdinand and Abdullah took it over and dragged folk into the church to be baptized. That did not happen. None of that happened, and no historian, Orientalist or otherwise, has been able to find any evidence of that. And then when you bring this blockbuster set of data, which again, he laid it out very clearly in his book, A Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period, exactly how he interpreted the data, how it might have been done differently, very transparent about it. And yet no one has challenged his basic premise and nor the general trend of what he did. So what's important about that is of course that it makes it finally, we hope to take down some of these things that just are so persistent in the discussion and Islamophobia and all those things. Because you know, we always laugh with our students that you know, there's this idea that somehow Islamic history is divided and it's spread between you know, Islam by the sword, but you know, it wasn't really, and and then those nice merchants and Sufis, you know, who spread it to that, you know, it's later that. That's not a useful construct. The other major point that underlies the book is also an idea that Richard Bulliet had made very clear, building upon Hudson with regard to the importance of what he called the Sharia minded, the importance of the ulama, which brought him to a most important concept, which is the view from the edge. That we could have written this book in probably even half the space if we had just done the view from the political center. If we had just recited the litany of one dynasty, you know, of the Khulafa Rashidun, and then after that dynasty point you can hardly count them. When Islam, and then they're calling it all this while the Islamic Empire, when in fact the unitary state didn't last very long at all. And the very rise of the Abbasids, where most called an empire at its golden age and all of that stuff, was already fragmented in several pieces by that time. So we have to think about it in a different way. And with all of the twists and turns of the political center, it doesn't tell you very much about society and what was going on, much less about the ulama, because it also, again, it will rely on the idea of theology, that Islam is a theocracy, which it absolutely isn't, not from the first, you know, of the rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who never made the claim of any kind to be, you know, at any other level like a clergy versus a laity. We don't have that concept. We don't have a centralized, you know, religious organization like the church, even though that keeps being imposed on it because of what also Sherman Jackson called false universals that tend to be imposed onto history. So it's very important to look at the edge, and that edge begins, I think, with the prophetic mandate, which is the core and motivating force of all of the institutions of Muslim culture, of Islamic culture. That is to say, at his farewell sermon, he basically gives the mandate to go forth, those who are here to those who are not here, extending not just to those who were in their vicinity or the other Sahaba who might not have been there, but down the ages, and to preserve the knowledge with fidelity and with trustworthiness. And in doing so, they created all of these institutions. And that moving edge, that existence of the ulama, often in opposition to the political center, to the dynasties, to the different rulers who who cannot be said to have universally, upheld the prophetic mandate or the Sharia or anything like that. But the idea of, finally being able to, in simple terms, refute the idea that Islam was a theocracy, which would have relied on someone who claimed some kind of level degree of infallibility. In contrast, the ulama as a class are mobile. They are the edge. The spread of Islam is the edge, which continues out. We're still in. We are at the edge right here in this room. Islam in America, this very complex, wonderful complex is part of, the view from the edge of Islam. Despite Islamophobia, despite, the tiny minority that we make up, we can look at the steady spread of Islam despite and alongside the movements at the political center, right down to our very own, nation state, post-colonial nation state.
Thank you so much, Sana. I think one of the major contributions of the book is to focus on the poetry, as you have said, and to focus on this ulama network, who are, as we regard as the hereditaries to the caliphate, like to the caliph, to the prophet. There's a very famous the hadith, as far as I know, the ulama are the caliphs to the prophet. And ulama'u warathatul anbiya. Thank you so much for that. So in this regard, that the political center is very important, but for this book to cover the ulama network and their central role in spreading Islam and in defending Islam is very, I think, was a major contribution of this book. One of the major contributions of this. I want to take you from there to the modern period, but I think we have time. I think we have time, right, Imam? Inshallah. You talk about the three gunpowders in the medieval century, in the medieval time, the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids. And the Ottomans are obviously the longest lasting empires until 1922. And the one who claimed the caliphate, of course, the other two also did, but the Ottomans were the one who survived, and then where the caliphate was abolished. And then there you talk about the millet system, where you had multicultural, multi-religious groups coexisting in the same place. So in that sense, the idea that the Muslims and non-Muslims, the scholars that we have mentioned in the early age of Islam, when the Muslims encountered the Christians, was not unique to that initial times, but also a phenomena that existed all the way to the modern time, to the end, to the rise of nationalism, it looks like. So here I want to take you to how you talk about liberal colonialism. If you can tell us, what is this? What is ideological re-engineering? What are this? So if you can inform us more about this, and how, and then you also, of course, talk about the modernization responses by the ulama. If you can connect that to the contemporary period, right now, as the ummah, where we are, what kind of challenges, signs of hope and signs of danger we have in the modern time, inshallah.
Yes, one of the things that I indicated or alluded to in the introductory remarks about the mentality that is dominated by the nation state being a post-colonial force, and we live in the post-colonial international world order. There are hard political, material aspects and dimensions to that, and then there are ideological, soft power, epistemic dimensions to that. And so I borrow from Halak in particular when trying to pin down how does Orientalism and how does the production of knowledge play into this dismemberment of the ummah by the colonial period. So as we're coming out of the Three Empires period, and the Ottoman Empire is particularly interesting because of the pressures it was under, its longevity, and also the Tanzimat reforms, and we talk about that the conversion of empires into nation states and the rise of nationalism, literally taking something, as Halak has identified, which is what the greatest strength perhaps of the ummah, which is its diversity and its ability to structurally accommodate diversity, not just diversity of ethnicities, but also, as we said, of confessions, of even legal systems, legal plurality under the Sharia, inside Sharia societies, all guarded by the ulama. Well, not to make it sound too romanticized or idealized, there were lots of problems, but compared to the rise of nationalism, which was a very, very revolutionary and novel way of organizing society that was predicated upon a type of homogeneity that Islamic and Islamicate societies did not know, did not care for, and weren't really that interested in, right? And yes, go ahead, Dr. Douglas.
I say, and doesn't exist. That kind of homogeneity is.
Well, it needs to be imposed. That's the thing. And as an Italian American, I mean, like this is not lost on me that, you know, Italy as one of the later European nations to unite in 1861, when Garibaldi said that we've made Italy, now we have to make Italians. And linguistically, the Venetians don't necessarily understand the Sicilians, and the Sicilians don't necessarily understand the Florentians. And you know, the concept of the nation state is clearly an artifice. And the same is true for France, and the same is true for England, and the same is true for Spain and different places. So this is very much an artificial project of homogenization that is diametrically opposed to that ethos that you mentioned that is woven through Islamic and Islamicate territories and empires that come before it. And none of it could have happened or been imposed upon the Muslim world if not for colonialism. But we don't want to understand colonialism in a superficial sense that conflates it. And many people who are a little bit hesitant to talk about the brutal legacy of colonialism, they conflate it with other types of conquest, and they don't make the proper distinctions that need to be made between what is colonialism and what is European colonialism and what are other types of conquest, because Muslims were involved in conquest, and there's no way to, you know, to shy away from that, nor should there be. However, when it comes to colonization, the European model was very, very unique. It wasn't necessarily unique at first. So the early period of colonization resembled much more brutal, straightforward types of domination and conquest that we're familiar with from the time of Columbus, basically, until we get to the 1750 mark or even the 1800s. It's mostly material. It's mostly about resource extraction. It's mostly about center and periphery, building roads and infrastructure in order to hasten and facilitate the extraction of resources and wealth from the periphery to the metropole, from the colony to the homeland. But once we hit the period of 1750 and get into the 1800s, we hit what I tried to coin the liberal age of colonialism. And I think that it's an interesting phenomenon to observe, that when we think of colonialism, we don't necessarily associate it with liberalism, when in reality the high water mark of colonialism is in the 1800s, is when the colonialism has morphed and evolved into something that's not just about resource extraction anymore. It's about social engineering. It's about reprogramming. They're talking about juridicality, one of the things that Halak talks about, the juridical dimension of colonialism. What is the role of Orientalism in this endeavor? Producing Islamic, quote unquote, scholars to codify Islamic law in India and in Indonesia and across the Muslim world. Why do they care? Because now it's about domination that's become more refined. It's about socially programming and engineering people who are now okay with their own domination and subservience and inferiority. And so there's a dimension to that that's in law. That's a juridical dimension of colonialism. There's also the dimension of that which is epistemic and has to do with knowledge production and the production of Islamic knowledge itself, which is where we find the rupture, where the previous regime of ulama and how the ulama were decentralized and they were financially independent. You had the waqf system, and they had this very, very organic and bottom-up way of producing knowledge, and that was why it was maybe more trustworthy. Then becomes something that is completely regimented, that is completely controlled, and it is controlled by none other than the colonial masters. And this is still the world that we inherit today. Even the Islamic University of Medina, you go to Dar al-Ulum and the other types of modern institutions that have come about. They're not the same, you know, for better or for worse. They're not the same as the traditional way of taking scholarship and producing knowledge that the Muslim world and the Islamicate had known for so long. So now what we have is we have ministries of education that exercise monopolies on educational institutions, and they're the ones that control the ijazas, and they're playing politics with who gets the ability to teach and who doesn't get the ability to teach. And that produces different types of Islamic discourse that either opens up or forecloses certain possibilities of political action, solidarity, and other things. And so, I mean, it's no secret, I'm tipping my cards here, that, this is a tragedy for the Ummah, because now that great counterbalance, which had existed between the ulama, fairly independently, fairly decentralized, able to produce knowledge that created a counterweight to the government and the shenanigans that the governments would attempt to commit. Now that counterweight has been taken away. Now you have the rule of the state. Now you have the imposition of nationalism. Now you have the limiting of Islamic discourse and the production of knowledge. And there's many, many other aspects to it where, we don't have time to go into all of it. But this is the era that we still live in today.
I'd like to build on this idea of nationalism that has been imposed on Muslim lands, Muslim regions of the world, which I much prefer to the term Muslim world. I try not to use it. I ask the students to catch me on it every time it pops out. But one of the elements of nationalism that emerged was this idea of competitive civilizations and defensive history. That each society that was overcome by colonialism had an admirable past, a glorious past. There were hopes that the modernizing leaders would restore somehow the greatness of each society when we had achieved some sort of development. So at the heart of the way we understand world history today, we have to understand that much of the way world history is taught and conceived of today is an artifact of the 19th and 20th century, particularly the 19th, when societies began to come to know each other. And one of the first impulses in that period, even 1500 to 1750, before before the Industrial Revolution, accelerated imperialism so much, you had the encounter of European societies that were unfamiliar with societies like China and India and Africa and other societies. Certainly there was a proximity with Islam. They knew each other. They were in some ways too close for comfort. You had the Crusades, you had the Reconquista in Spain. So the way they approached these societies with greatness and longevity, and which certainly had contributed enormously to knowledge in society as a whole, was to sort of grade them and to recognize them that, well, they were great, certainly, and they did this, this, and this, and they began to recognize certain inventions that had arrived, at Europe's doorstep, great and gratuitously. But then they were in decline. They were all recognized as having somehow been in decline. This was the worst thing about the coverage to this day in textbooks, is this idea of golden age and decline, that where the rise of the Ottoman Safavids and Mughals is seen, its decline is seen right away within it, even though it was in many ways extremely comparable to the monarchies and empires of the Western world. So we have to look back and have our students understand the context in which these kinds of civilizational contributions took place and how they were transmitted to the West. There's this tendency, which we try to counter, of considering this golden age that was supposedly during the Abbasid period you mentioned with, the House of Wisdom and all of that. And then, however, after such and such, you can put dates here and there, and say, oh, it was this, that, then it was in decline, and that there was no more output, as though they kind of rolled over and played dead. And particularly when the Europeans began to penetrate the Indian Ocean and reach across the Pacific from the Atlantic, that somehow these societies were recognized for what they were, but recognized within this sort of bubble. So we find it very important for people to understand that they don't need to. And Muslim societies, in the context of nationalism, have very much embraced this idea of this golden age. When in fact, people like Ahmed Paul Keeler, in his book Mizan, which is really to be recommended, talks about the for a second. He talks about the period of the flourishing of science as having been the formative period. Many don't recognize, later periods. They say they were imitative and they were commentaries on commentaries and this nonsense, but in fact, that's not the case. Both Islam continued to spread continued to be intellectually vital, and people were quite well aware of what was going on. In the context of this idea of, what we got from them, this was a core idea that nationalism sort of promoted, was we have to, sell our civilizational bona fide somehow, and put it within the context of nations. We hope that our students will understand where and when and how and by whom this intellectual transfer took place. And I have one example that I like to talk about, which also informs the concept of Islamicate, is when you think about the transmission, say, of Indian numerals from the Sanskrit tradition by Persian scholars who were writing in Arabic and used it to discuss Greek mathematical concepts and wrote it all down on Chinese paper. That's the context in which this intellectual ferment period took place. And people like Edmund Burke III talked about a very different way of thinking about this concept of golden age and contributions, and what I always emphasize is what we got from them, emphasizing the them and the we as, this nationalistic kind of, I call it defensive history. And his idea is, I think, very valid, that what spurred the modern, what makes up the foundations of modernity is in fact the collective intellectual, artistic, technological expertise of collective humanity, particularly in the Eastern Hemisphere, not because the Western Hemisphere was deficient, but because they were not connected in those networks. So probably the core of the book is and the reason that we were asked to write it by Dr. Peter Stearns was in fact to place this period into some kind of context, a global context, which doesn't see contributions to modernity as a zero-sum game of some kind. And so I think that's important for our students to carry away, for the public to generally get a different idea than what we've been practicing and what many other nations are practicing as this defensive history.
Thank you so much, Ustad. I think it's very important not to associate, as you have said, the decline of the political entities with the decline of religion or civilization. So the decline of the decline of the Mughals, the Safavids, or any political entity or political center is not necessarily the decline of the Muslims, because as we have already said multiple times, that the ulama, the scholars, were the main actors in defending, producing the knowledge. And the problem with the modern time, as the Ustad Imam said, is the interruption of this knowledge production, which was financed mainly by the independent Waqf lens. And one of the main targets of the liberal colonialism that he mentions was the Waqf lens of Al-Azhar, the Waqf lens of Sulaimani and other places in all over the Muslim world, where the Muslim scholars are, like, to be honest, like producing their knowledge, and they are raised without any independent, without any external pressure by political governments or powers. Those are interrupted, the knowledge production process interrupted, so that we, in the modern times, the challenge that we have, the main challenge that we have is that we don't have the scholars, independent ulama, scholars, who can produce this knowledge and who can, produce the Islamic knowledge that will serve the Muslims. But I see signs of, like, these are all pessimistic, approaches. But what I see at the end of the book is, though there are signs of danger, there is authoritarianism on the rise in the not just in the Muslim world, but all over the world. But also there is occupations, the warfare everywhere. The Muslims are suffering, and other like southern countries are suffering. The south world. Still, there is hope that the Muslims and the people having more access to knowledge, to Islamic knowledge, and also they are able to produce perspectives to the global challenges. And these are the signs of hope that I have seen. Maybe you can reflect on that before we end the session and open the stage for the audience for their questions, inshallah. Do we have signs of hope, Imam?
Yes, absolutely. It's not all doom and gloom. First of all, because I believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Maybe you can connect that with how you talk about the Muslims in America and Muslims in the West, how they live,
well,
and they are independent here relatively compared to other Muslim countries. They're relatively independent Muslim communities here, not under, not under specific political power telling them what is Islamic, what is not.
Yes.
Maybe
Yes, part of the I think part of the structure of history, right, and especially of the last 100 years, is when the Muslims are down, so to speak, in simple language, whether it's the Crusades or the Mongols or whatever. There's that happens for a period, and then there's a rallying that takes place. And it seems to me, I very much believe that we're in that type of rallying period right now. And it's interesting that with social media and the interconnectivity of the world, with the specific type of globalization that we're under, which has many, many um, negative consequences, both ecologically, also for labor, also for, inequality. But some of the positive aspects of it have been a reuniting of the ummah at certain points and in certain places and in certain languages. That if I travel, for example, as I do sometimes to Malaysia or to Indonesia or to Turkey or to different places, you will find people who are plugged into an international, maybe Muslim intelligentsia, and these bonds are being made, whether it's, there's the Prophetic Strategy Summit, there's GEMS Summit that just happened in Doha. The actual nations themselves that host these things, they rotate depending on the opportunity that they get. Turkey was a hot spot. Üsküdar and Başakşehir was a hot spot of scholarship and refuge, as many of the ulama fled from the counter-revolution after the Arab Spring. As the political situation in Turkey became more difficult and the economy became more difficult, many of them now, Qatar and Doha is popping up. People are in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and Indonesia. There's a lot of movement and there's a lot of connectivity and networking going on. There's a lot of initiatives that are going on. So the Ummah is coming into conversation with itself once again, as Walter Rodney said, that the grounding with my brothers, that these conversations are happening in many different languages, and things are starting to be figured out. That there's a lot of things to look forward to and to be hopeful with, and many national actors are also, at the level of governments are assisting in that, and then even more so the non-governmental actors with the think tanks and different initiatives of this sort. So I think we have a lot to be hopeful with.
When in Islamic history has there ever been more access to our documents? We have our original documents. We have our original sources. They have come through the prophetic mandate that day, and we got all the way to the present day. And how many people would have had access earlier, when someone like Ibn Sina would have had to go and wheedle his way into some courtly library where he would take up residence for a while. Or have to go to the feet of a scholar and sit and read the books, which is great, right? But now we have access to these things, and we have those networks within the work. So I think that it's certainly a sign of hope. I work in the educational sphere first and foremost, and I think we need to, and we're able to arm our students with an understanding not only of what happened, looking at it from different perspectives, like the view from the edge, like the view about the foolishness of the golden age and decline idea, and then we can also equip them to speak about it, to know how to counter these kinds of arguments. And I have a little among my photos that I carried around with me. We have, if we look again at this piece of nationalistic defensive history, we have a sort of cultural movement in the West where the ideas of Samuel Huntington have started out as this modernization theorist that again the rise of these false universals, that if the world were to develop, it had to be along the same pattern that European had. And then he came along in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union to talk about this theory of the clash of civilizations. And while it's dismissed by many scholars, nonetheless, it's out there in the popular discourse. And I ran across this quote by Samuel Huntington coming out of the Clash of Civilizations, where he addresses this idea of what you mentioned about feeling down and feeling, that if we're down, it must mean that something happened, that we got off track or something of that nature. or that it was the West's superiority, which it certainly claimed. It claimed to be the pinnacle of human progress, you know. And I remember as a young student, I bought that hook, line, and sinker until I didn't any longer. So here's the quote from Samuel Huntington. Quote, "The West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather by its superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do. But I think we have something better than that to offer. But it's certainly there is, you know, it's a remarkable statement when, you know, this idea of the clash of civilizations is unfortunately, and the idea of this cultural, somehow people can't, the cultures exist in some sort of opposition that has become so current right now in this country, even within the Western tradition. That I think we have something better to offer, and that's what we need to convey to the public and to our young people."
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor. And I would like to, if we have some more time, I would like to open the stage for the audience here, attending in person, to ask some questions if they have. And for the online audience, if they can write it in the chat box. If you have the time, Imam Tom, do you? Inshallah. So we will start with the audience who are here, who took the time to come here all the way. And inshallah, we are going to enjoy some Samir and Facha. Sorry, we will not be able to offer you Imam Tom. But inshallah, soon, when you are here, and all the other the audience who are wherever they are in Turkey and other places, they are all welcome. Once they come there, simit and chai, tea is on me, inshallah. So now the stage is to open for the audience. If they have any questions, they can just go ahead and say it to whomever they want to ask. The authors are here. If not, I will be waiting for the chat box, inshallah. Should I read it? Yeah, let me read it. I'm a college professor, literature and writing, and a revert to Islam, an advisor to our Muslim Student Association. I have long lamented the fact that scholarly institutions tend to neglect the spiritual life of our students, at least in our classroom. There is a piece of them we do not get to experience. I'm taken by your comment, Imam Tom, about the ways that we tend to sideline divine revelation as a source of knowledge. How might college do better in this regard?
Yeah, this is a key point, and it's a reflection that is explored theoretically by Talal Asad, among other scholars, in books like Formations of the Secular, about how part of the problem is that with the imminent frame of secularism, the religious self or the spiritual self is seen as optional and non-essential, right? It's not granted truth or status as truth. The real self is the material self. Your psychology, perhaps, is the furthest you're going to get, your mental health. But beyond that, then you can have this thing over here for those things that you believe. The only models that I've seen that have pushed back with some efficacy are usually coming out of the Native American and indigenous communities, especially in Canada with the First Nations peoples. They have attempted to articulate what they call epistemic sovereignty and recognition of their sacred teachings. And I find that very, very interesting and also profound and in need of further exploration. Rather than go through an identitarian model, right, which is stuck in what someone claims they are or believes that they are, to center the sacred teachings as having their own rights and sovereignty and necessarily respect is something that is quite different. And so I think that that is something that Muslims should explore, especially in the United States, exploring what does it mean to center our sacred teachings and to consider our sacred teachings. And this goes back to getting away from the bias of cognition and get back into embodied learning, right? That if you internalize and comport yourself to a sacred teaching, it literally becomes part of who you are. So I think that we need to, this is something that has to be articulated. It's not legible right now because we haven't articulated it. I think that we really have to articulate this, how the sacred teachings instantiate themselves in us and in our bodies, and therefore they deserve a certain amount of respect and even recognition. And the possibilities would, I think, unfurl from there.
Thank you so much, Imam Tom. Do we have other questions here in the room? If not, the audience joining us virtually, they can turn on their mic and then just instead of writing, they can just say it, inshallah. We will give them a few seconds. Yeah, we have a question here in Jerome, Imam Tom.
You know, as both speakers were speaking, you know, I couldn't help but also think about what Imam Malik, you know, said. He said, لن يصلح هذه الأمة آخر هذه الأمة إلا ما صلح أولها, which means that the latter of the Ummah will not be rectified except that which rectified the former of the Ummah, which is the earlier generations of the Ummah. So how would you, I don't know if your book, you mentioned anything about this concept, or if not, how would you apply it in this day and age in the West, in the United States? And this question is for both speakers.
I can see he wants to say something right
Yeah.
away.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this is essentially the question of tajdīd, of how do you make tajdīd? And intellectual tajdīd, I think, is part of the time in which we are in, the renewal and the revival. And there's several theoretical and practical questions that need to be answered about tajdīd. And it captures the spirit of the statement by Imam Malik about what are the things that made the first generation so viable and successful. There are certain individual things, there are certain collective things, there are certain attitudinal things, and there are certain practical things, there are certain institutional things. Related to the book, and we don't necessarily explicitly go through this in the book, but I do think that this book is a very significant first step to exploring tajdīd. I think that seeing the structure of the society, right? Again, the decentralized knowledge production, decentralized autonomous knowledge production of the ulama, is a key thing. Organizing the finances around the awqaf, right? These are key fundamental institutions. It's not a surprise nor a coincidence that the colonizers went after these institutions first when they encountered the Muslim world. And, you know, studies show that up to half of real estate was tied up in charitable endowments, in awqaf. That's a huge obstacle to fulfilling your plot. So I think setting things up and taking that seriously, I think giving the type of honor, one thing that we didn't talk about, but it's highly relevant to knowledge production in the modern age. Most places in the Muslim world do look down upon studying Islam. If you score high on your tests in Egypt, you will go to study medicine. You will not go to study Islam, and that is designed that way. So we're putting our weakest minds often to study the deen, and then we're bemoaning the state of scholarship. Those two things obviously have a relationship. So when we recapture the type of honor, and we could even borderline say celebrity, though I don't mean the type of celebrity that social media influencers and celebrity sheikhs have today. I actually find that quite repugnant. But something of the honor and celebrity that those imams had, Imam Malik and Abu Hanifa and Shafi'i and Imam Ahmed, that they were followed by crowds. People would travel the Muslim world in order to sit at their feet and to study from them. It was, you could say, a society that was optimized for that type of spiritual, autonomous, decentralized knowledge production. I think if I have to put my money, I'll make a halal bet on one thing, I think that's it. I think that if we can get back to that, it will solve quite a bit of our issues.
I think part of that also is the sense of, I definitely agree that it's very tiresome to talk about religion in terms of identity and then of authenticity of what is and isn't within the bounds of Islam, and what a person claims as their identity, and, you know, what Islam says, you know, in this sense. Instead, feeling that connection to the prophetic mandate that's so simple that it knocks you over. when you think how simple it is, that we are part of this unbroken chain that leads back to the Prophet's teachings, and that our institutions and our integrity and our documents and our scripture, all of those things, and the things that grew out from them, we are part of it. You know, we are the edge. We are, you know, the leading edge, in fact, not to take that as a claim, but as the people of this generation. And I think that is also profoundly a spiritual connection that goes beyond, you know, identity claims or culture claims or anything of that nature. And I think there's a lot of hope in that, again, because we have the tools. We don't have a distorted set of scriptures. We don't have a distorted, you know, distorted or flawed access to the foundational documents that we can still draw upon and discuss. And I think, in the sense that we're not even the first wave of renewal after the shock of you know, imperialism, colonialism, modernity itself, which, you know, even everyone has to deal with unintended consequences of all of these things. So I think there's plenty of hope, but there's also lots of danger out there, and it's, you know, a question of joining hands with those who also oppose, particularly what's going on right now in this country, but it's not unique to the United States. It's quite widespread, this kind of return to authoritarianism. And I was listening to an interview on Dca from Arundhati Roy, who said, well, you know, after the corruption of the mainstream media, people have fled to the internet, which they could click off in, you know, the push of a button. So we might need to think about sorts of networks that we have to strengthen, that may be the people who are within our proximity, and reaching out from there to secure what we have. And also communicate. People are hungry to understand. Lots of people, young people, I talk with all kinds of audiences of teachers and others, and many of us do sort of interfaith discussions. People don't know, and they're really quite amazed when they learn even the basics of what Islam has to offer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Imam Tom, and thank you so much, Dr. Hizam, for your contributions and for this beautiful book. That was all about Islam and world history. It looks like at what chapter, if we pose a question, at what chapter of history we are now, of Islamic history or Muslim history, let's say, it looks like we are in an age or period of revival. And based on the conversation, what I have understood is that the key to success in this revival or renewal or reform movement is to be loyal to the usul. That's why they say tajdīd mu'assal, rooted revival, a revival that is rooted in the usul and the main sources of Islam. And that's a term that is mentioned in the book as the prophetic mandate, let's say. And some people would say Quran and Sunnah. Some other people would mention with references to Imam Malik and other companions and ashab. The key, but looks like the key to success in this reform movement, revival, is to make it rooted. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make these kind of gatherings full of barakah and blessing, and make us learn and act based on this knowledge. And inshallah, we will continue to understand and explore the rich and diverse legacy of Islam and Islamicate civilization, let's say, to understand Islam better. And that's the key to how identify ourselves, to make our identity, because Islam is our main identity. And the way to understand and to introduce ourselves, the most important way is to know our own history. Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you so much for our guests and for our audience here. Thank you so much for your presence. And inshallah, we will host you soon in person, Ustad, Imam, and all the audience who are joining us virtually. Thank you so much to Turkey. It looks like it's late there. And now, inshallah, we are going to enjoy some refreshments here in the room. Thank you so much
for having us, and for, you know, this beautiful place that we, you know, that anchors our community.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Any refreshment for Prof. Tom?
I think Imam Tom left once he
virtual.
He's in North Carolina.
Maybe he's driving toward here
doing lots
for the
of
refreshment.
Yeah, so going through, I'm sure he has people taking care of his lunch and all of that. We managed to carve out some time between the different engagements to do this. And thank you for your patience also.